We've been doing something very special in our home over the past, I'd say, 3 weeks maybe. And that is every night we've been just sort of rehearsing two things. One is we're going through the gospel afresh with our kids, just at a very granular level, just to sort of reinforce that. But then on the other side, we've been going through the stories. It's almost like our testimony of our individual life with Christ, our married life with Christ, our ministry life with Christ, just to sort of familiarize our kids. We did this years ago, and it's interesting as our kids grow up. They're sort of like some of these stories they seem to have never heard, which either we didn't share them or so I don't know.
Maybe they just weren't paying attention the first time. Who knows?
But I don't know what it's, because you and I haven't really talked specifically about it on the impact it's had for us, but it's been invigorating for me. It's been really special to just remember the sweetness of the fellowship that we had with Jesus when we were young. There can be so many barnacles that grow onto this in and through ministry, in and through leadership, in and through seeing just sort of the yuck side of things in ministry. And it's just so precious. And it just makes me appreciate Jesus and what he did in our lives so deeply going through that. But
it's been really interesting to realize that some of our kids are the same age that we were when God was doing these things in our lives, and how even at that young age, it still affects us to this day. Yeah. Like the foundational truths that God worked in our lives when we were 17, 18, 19, 20, it still impacts everything that we do in our ministry, in our home. And that's a really powerful thing to think about, that God's work is so deep, and it pervades an entire lifetime when you allow those roots to go deep.
Yeah, Hudson's brought it up quite a few times, being 20. He's like, he keeps saying, how old were you at that time? And I'm not thinking what he's thinking. I'm just trying to answer the question. I'm like, I was like, I guess 19 or 20. He's like, I'm like actually older than you were in that, because these are stories he's heard probably more than any of the other kids. Yep. And he just can't believe that he's older than I was in that story.
That's kind of hard for me to believe too. But
it's sort of ridiculous. One of us is getting older. I'm not sure which one.
It's definitely you. You're 5 years older, so
that's true. I'm aging faster as a result, and I actually do feel like I'm aging faster. Something about the age of 50, I think, does trigger something in the body, which is like, I better hurry up and age. So I have felt a little more of that. But we wanted to maybe just go through and rehearse the history of our public communications, like our public speaking. It's a unique aspect of our life that I don't think either one of us, when we were young, when we were dreaming about what we could do with our life, ever thought of doing what we do. And, I wanted to be, a dentist. I wanted to be an architect. I wanted to be a professional football player, and then I wanted to be a professional basketball player. I was okay with being a professional baseball player.
I think your mom told you the only thing you could do would be to be a golfer.
Yeah, she was
you
like,
weren't built for
Eric,
anything else.
You're built more like a golfer. I remember thinking, thanks. That's definitely encouraging. But how about you? What were you dreaming of being?
I think when I was really young, I wanted to be a writer, but not the kind of books we write, like Nancy Drew adventure mystery novels. And I used to write tons of mystery stories that were, The Mystery of the X is one of the ones I remember from elementary school, and it had all these chapters, and I don't even know if it ever resolved, but it was a really exciting story. I want to be a mystery writer, I guess you could say that. But then as I got older, I really wanted to be a musician, and I actually was headed pretty proactively down that road. Yep.
When I met you, we went through that story with the kids.
A singer-songwriter and a Christian artist, basically, is what I was setting my life towards.
And so when we met, I was actually studying vocal training at a very high level. And so first time we ever got together, which wasn't a date, it was actually, because you're 5 years younger than me, you were 15, I believe, the night
16.
I met you.
Oh yeah, I think I was
You turned 16 the next day. Mm-hmm. And so, but we can say that to create some shock value. And the first time we got together, I don't remember how it worked, but it was over at my house, which is my parents' house. And we both played for each other these songs that we had written. So music was a bonding point for us. But I don't think either of us would have dreamt that we would be on stages speaking to thousands of people at a time. I mean,
Yeah.
we've
Well, I think that they say the number 2 fear in the world is public speaking. I think the first one is like pain, suffering, death or something.
torture. Yeah.
So it's really not something most people get excited about. Definitely not something I ever felt comfortable with. I think I read or heard a quote recently that was something like the human brain is a wonderful thing. Like it starts working, when you're first born, and it doesn't stop working until you get in front of a large audience. And I've felt that before, getting in front of a huge audience and having your mind just go completely blank. And who wants to be in that kind of situation? So I can see why most people aren't drawn to it.
Yeah.
I think you were more of a natural public speaker than I was growing up. It
was never really a stress. I wouldn't call it a stress point for me. So I never really understood that dynamic when people would say that.
I could be in front of people to do songs or even to act in a play or something, but to speak, just things that were on my heart to share or prepare something, that was really intimidating for me. So we definitely did not have the ambition, we're going to be public speakers.
So I don't know if you would be able to answer this off the cuff. I don't even know that I could. Like, hardest moments in your speaking career or most embarrassing moments? I mean, do you have any thoughts?
Well, for me, I immediately think about our first trip to Australia because we did a speaking tour there. This was like just a couple years into our ministry and marriage.
And it had been the second year.
Yeah, we were really young and very new to speaking and very new to travel, especially international travel. So we didn't know all the tips and tricks for jet lag and how to function when you land in a foreign country and you're on a totally opposite time zone. So we just immediately went to go speak at some church or some school or something. And I remember
in your most embarrassing moment, because I'm feeling like I
think maybe we both were, but I remember being up on stage and feeling like there was cotton in my brain. Yeah. I had no idea where I was, what I was talking about, wasn't making any sense. And I remember just having this moment of total panic, like I started a story and I couldn't remember the ending of it. I think that actually happened to you, but probably not at the same exact time.
Yeah, I had that happen in Australia. That's why I was thinking, are you just setting me up to say I think my most embarrassing moment is...
and we somehow fudged our way through it, I think. Maybe. I don't know. But
yeah, there's a few painful memories in that for me.
But there were a lot of times, there were a lot of moments
I remember
speaking.
It was in Australia. I think it was that same trip because we had multiple speaking locations there because we were traveling along the eastern coastline. And I remember being in a church. I remember someone saying, "This is Rebecca St. James's church." If you remember that one. And I remember being up on stage and literally I was saying something, and I floated. This is the way it felt, at least. I floated outside my brain, and I was out here, and I was looking at myself going, I'm talking right now. I am saying something. I hope it's intelligent. And then I was thinking, I need to get back into that head. I mean, it was so disorienting.
To speak publicly with bad jet lag is just not recommended. I just think it's terrible. And nobody should ever do it. And somehow
we've gotten a lot better at that type of stuff.
I remember also being at an event in Texas. This was also really early when we first started speaking, early in the first couple years.
Oh, yeah.
And some crazy thing had happened with our flight.
I think it was Lufkin.
And I remember back in that time, I didn't wear anything decent or professional. Like I wore really comfortable clothes for the plane. So it was like really baggy sweats and
just for clarity, it was decent.
Decent in the sense of, it was modest.
It wasn't speaking.
It wasn't decent for public speaking though. It was like sloppy baggy sweats with Birkenstocks and, an old sweatshirt, and my hair was up in a clip. And we had this fiasco with our trip.
I was wearing sweats too, by the way, in this.
But story. You looked better than I did. Anyway, I had basically rolled out of bed and gotten on the plane. And all my clothes were in the checked bag or whatever.
We were going to arrive, 4 hours early?
Yeah, we were going to have a whole half day to get take a shower, get dressed, do everything. And the luggage got lost. We were delayed. We basically had to run. Just to make a long story short, we had to race to the venue and race out of the car and go straight up on stage and start speaking. So that was really embarrassing because I didn't feel at all prepared, and I felt like I looked my worst. And that was a huge event, probably 500 to 700 teenagers, but it worked. I mean, we made it work. But we had a lot of moments like that in the early days because we didn't know what we were doing. That wouldn't happen today. But
do you remember the time when we were in Spokane speaking. It was that was a huge event. I don't think it was the Opera House one, but it was
I think that was at Gonzaga University.
Well, whatever it was a big event, and it was the night before where we were doing a parents event. So it was like a citywide in Spokane event, very large. And you had been there early. I don't remember why I wasn't and why you were, but you had been on some key TV interviews.
Well, that's because we were supposed to both be there for the TV interviews. They were doing a lot of publicity for this event. I think it was because it was a very big event, and we were supposed to both be interviewed on local TV and different things, and you missed your flight. I don't know why I was there a little bit early, but it wasn't so that I could do these interviews by myself, but that's what ended up happening.
So, yeah, I mean, you gave away some of the punchline, but I'm my nickname in missionary school was PTM, Perfectly Timed Man. And so I'm the type of guy that doesn't arrive at the airport right before my plane is going to leave. I get there 2.5 hours early. And so I still don't know all the dynamics of why this happened, but I did some kind of mathematical figuring in my head of when I needed to leave, which I do all the time. And I figure it out. And as I'm driving to the airport, I realize that I did something wrong in my math and that I'm actually going to miss my flight. And so I'm already on the phone just driving there and trying to get in touch with whoever it was, if it's our event director at the time, just saying, I don't know how to explain this to you, but I am going to miss my flight. I need to get a new flight.
That meant I had to do all these.
That's why you had to do those
all these interviews by myself, and that was terrifying. I remember one was actually Fox News. I think it was the local affiliate for Fox News, but that was a whole new territory because when we spoke together, I could always lean on you to step in if my mind went blank or if I needed, more clarity with what I was saying. Now I was doing this completely by myself. That was awkward.
So I remember I got in and they had a car waiting for me that was on, and I had to grab my bags, run out to the car, and then they screeched out of the airport. And the event had already started.
I had to start, and usually you open.
I always open to warm up the audience.
Because that's your specialty, humor, loosen up the crowd. That's definitely not my gift.
And I think it's been going, you had to carry it for 20 minutes.
It was a while. Yeah, I had to start the whole thing.
I think we even started with worship. We were
trying to buy as much time as we could.
Disaster. I mean, that was just horrifying for me.
I think through all of that, though, you do see God growing you up, and you see his faithfulness. And every single one of those situations, we look back and we remember the horror of missing a flight or not saying something perfectly because we had jet lag or whatever, not looking, the way we wanted to look. But God always came through and did a powerful work in spite of our weakness. And that's what we saw all throughout all of our years of speaking.
So embarrassing, we have very funny things, memories, but it's interesting because it'd be fascinating if we were to just have some kind of test where we answered questions. It's have you enjoyed your speaking career? Is this a pleasure for you, or is it something that you have chosen to have a good attitude in? What would your response be?
I think there's been some really fulfilling and rewarding moments. I know in those early days, especially just seeing the impact of what God was doing through those messages. The very first time we spoke in an official sense, it was in Boulder, Colorado at kind of a mega church, and it was to about 700 teenagers. And I remember the whole event, I was absolutely miserable. I did not want to be on that stage. I did not want to be sharing our love story and these key principles with these teenagers because they didn't want to hear us. Most of them were glaring at us and they were rolling their eyes and they were just not taking it seriously. And it was total just obedience, just sheer obedience that we were even there, that God had opened this door and prompted us to say yes to this. But I was wanting to get out of there. It was a 2-night event. And so the first night, I didn't feel like it went that well. And I remember getting a migraine that night because I was so stressed out about the whole thing. And then the second night, I just wanted to get it over with. And the very end of the event, you were waxing long as usual. And I was supposed to be playing background music on the piano, worship music to kind of set the stage for an altar call type of setting. And I did not think anyone would respond.
Who's going to possibly respond?
And so I'm just playing the songs okay, come on. Let's just get out of here. And yet then I looked up and I saw all over the whole church, there were these, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of youth, children, not children, but teenagers and young adults on their faces, just crying out to God, surrendering their lives to God in a really genuine, powerful way. And it wasn't an emotionally contrived thing because we had no idea how to even do that at the time.
I think we also, in conviction, did not want to whip up people's emotion. Right. We know that doesn't create deep discipleship when you respond just out of emotion as opposed to
we just really were not. I mean, I think you had a lot of humor in how you delivered messages, but mostly it was just rock solid, biblical, straightforward truth. And those young people were so hungry for it, and they responded so wholeheartedly that was a moment where I began to recognize, okay, this is something we're called to, and God is going to work through these messages. So moments like that, and I would say everywhere we went from that point forward, because that was our first official speaking event, we saw a similar response.
Well, can you rank some of, even if you were just to describe the event, not go into detail in it, what are some of the most impacting responses that we ever saw around the world?
Well, definitely Australia. So you can go into that story in a minute. We even though we had jet lag, we eventually got over the jet lag, and we saw God do some really incredible things. There was also an event in Wisconsin that was probably our absolute worst speaking event ever, but it turned out to be one of our most powerful. So I remember those moments. I would say though, even though it was so exciting to be a part of what God was doing through people in people's lives, through the messages we were speaking. Speaking itself has never been something I've necessarily enjoyed or felt that good at. You know, people tell me, how did you become a public speaker, and do you like it? And I think a lot of times people think of it as kind of romantic. You know, you're up there in front of people and delivering this dynamic message, and people are responding, and you're touring around. It really was never romantic. It was never glamorous. It was always hard. Also, as we've talked about before in previous episodes, so much spiritual warfare. I mean, it was just onslaughts of spiritual attack in the midst of trying to communicate truth. So I would say it's been very hard. It's not something anyone should ever do just for the fun of it. It's something you should do out of obedience. But the rewarding part is to see how powerfully God has worked through the speaking and the messages that we've shared.
Yeah. Yeah. Our Australia was, I think, probably the closest thing we've ever seen to real revival. Now, we've seen at Ellerslie, we've seen similar things, like where I call them micro revivals, where they don't really spread through the town. They don't really spread across the country. So I don't really want to call them revivals, but they have all the signs of historic, old-fashioned, classic revival, where people are broken with sin. They're on their faces weeping, and it goes on for hours. Everything just sort of shuts down, and you just sort of turn off all the other schedule demands, and you just sort of say, okay, God, you do what you need to do. And I think the first time we ever witnessed that was in Australia, and neither of us were expecting it. I'm trying to remember. It'd be fascinating because I know it was one of the first events we did in Australia, but it wasn't our jet lag one. I think what we did is we got there and we were speaking at some schools to market, and that's when our brain was like going wild. And I mean, because I have some very embarrassing memories from that, and I think we had a night event first for youth, and then I spoke on was it a Sunday morning or at this huge church, which was right in the center of the news at the time in Australia, because this quote unquote revival had come there. And so when we were, I think it was, I want to say even the night before, I don't remember, we'd had this youth event, and this isn't the revival one, but I remember, I think my brain was still not working very well in that one. And do you remember, that was one of my most embarrassing moments?
Oh yeah, that was where you said you were going to pray for everyone.
I made a statement. It's like, anyone, I don't know why I would say this. First of all, I was just trying to survive the talk to get to the end of it so I could go to bed. And I decided, maybe I didn't think anyone would respond. I don't know. This is one of our first things.
We
with
really
the
did
response.
not know what we were doing. We were just being obedient, but we made a lot of mistakes. And one of them was when you're that exhausted and jet lagged, you don't tell people you're going to individually pray for everyone who comes to the front.
Anyone who comes down to the front for prayer, I will go around and pray for you. It's like, what was I thinking? And basically the entire sanctuary empties out of their, seats, pews, and comes down to the front. There was a mob down there. I mean, hundreds.
So it was going to take hours to personally pray for all these people.
And so this is part of the humor of, young Eric. It's somewhat embarrassing to even think about, but I sort of defaulted, instead of going into supernatural mode, which is what I would encourage everyone to do.
And I think that's something we did not understand.
We did not understand supernatural mode.
When you're in a situation where your strength is totally gone, there is that supernatural enabling power that you can tap into to do ministry that you could never do in your own strength. But we had no clue about that.
And so I wasn't tapping into it. I was tapping into the remaining battery life that I had, which was, on, 0.01%. And so I was going around, and if it was a guy, I would pray for them with the man of God prayer. And if it was a girl, I had what I called the princess prayer. Oh, Lord, bless this princess and shape her into a woman of God. And, good prayers. They're good, solid prayers, but they were canned, if you could say it that way. They were sort of pre-processed and ready to just sort of shoot out. And I had seen this one girl walk up with blonde hair, and that could seem like it has no value in the story, except for when I finally got around to the middle section where that girl with long blonde hair was. When I came up to her and I stuck my hand on her shoulder and I began to give her the princess prayer, her head went and turned towards me, and out of that princess came a deep, bassy male voice.
It was a guy. When you looked at his face, it was a guy with
it's
long
like,
hair.
Before you go any further, you may want to know that I'm a guy. Now, that came out with an Australian accent, and I can't do an Australian accent very well. But it does rank up there as one of those.
I had to wonder, what kind of impact did you possibly have on this guy, praying that he was.
So this is the context for what I think was the next day, where I was going to, I think it was the same place. That's why
I think it was the same city.
And I was told that, every person that has spoken in this pulpit to the general audience, the last 28 times there has been revival that has taken place. And
what they meant by revival, I think, was emotional hype.
Yeah.
Like
it was laughter. It was barking. It was roaring like lions. It was weird stuff. Okay. Stuff that, is not classic revival. Let me just be honest and blunt about that. And so this is like classic young Eric too, is I risked everything by giving a message called True Revival. And this, I would say this is a defining moment in our speaking career, because we're in a foreign culture. All the eyes, the news was watching what was taking place. They had just been on the news either that day or the day before about this issue of this revival that is taking place in Australia in this church. And now I'm the next speaker, and I'm going to speak on True Revival, and no one laughed, no one barked, no one roared. And
you could basically hear a pin drop. It was just total silence. It was a very convicting, challenging message about what it really means to be revived, which is giving everything you are, laying everything down.
First, you have to be broken over your sin before you can be made strong and whole.
Completely surrendering your life to Jesus Christ. And they'd never really been challenged with a message like that. And so it was very just like a bomb had just gone off or something. It was really, but it was powerful. It wasn't like in a bad way. They were feeling this conviction of the Holy Spirit, but it was very beautiful.
And so, but at that point, no one had responded. Nothing had happened. It was just totally silent, totally still. And I had the voice of the devil just jumping all over me that I'd ruined it. This church had something beautiful going, and then I came in and just punctured it. And I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I invited you up onto the stage to play the piano. Mm-hmm. And then I left the stage.
And left a microphone.
I set a microphone down. I said, if there's anyone in here that needs to make things right before the body of Christ, basically the concept of confessing sin within the body, then I'm going to leave the microphone here. And meanwhile, I went to the back and sat down.
I could tell God was really working in people's hearts. It wasn't like they were sitting in stony silence. There was like a a very like a thick sense of, God's doing something, but nobody wanted to be the first one to break the silence. And I mean, this has just never happened in this group before, but it was a young girl. She was probably 14 or 15 that came up first. And it was really powerful.
She made things right with her dad, that she had publicly dishonored him in front of the body. And then he came up, they hugged. It was a very, very moving situation. But then all these other people got out of their chairs and this line formed around the church. Mm-hmm. And one after another, people were confessing their sin, weeping, crying. I mean, it was one of the most powerful things I think we'd ever witnessed. 2 hours into that, someone comes up and says, when he first set down the microphone, I left. And I said, there's no way, God, that I'm going to share this. And then I told God, okay, I'll go back in 2 hours. If it's still going, I'll share this. And so I'm going to share it now. I mean, this was the first thing. I think this happened 2 or 3 other times in our tour through Australia where we saw the same dynamic take place. It's weird because in America, it never happened. And then we go into Australia where we're fumbling around, we're making these mistakes. We're just a young couple. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know how old I must have been. What are we going to say?
Mid-20s,
24,
probably,
25? Yeah. And you were 20.
We had seen really powerful responses to the messages that we shared. And I think
this is a whole nother level. This is like
back in the first episode of this series, we talked about how even though we might be invited in to speak on like purity or romance or relationships, we would always bring it back to that place of giving your life completely to Jesus Christ, like total surrender. And whenever we did that, it was like, especially young people would say, we've been waiting our whole lives to just hear someone challenge us to what real Christianity is. And you're finally the ones who have said, this is what it means to be right with God. And they had been used to being coddled and entertained. And when we came in, it was not entertaining necessarily. There was some humor in it, but it was like a very hard-hitting message. And they respond really eagerly to that. But I think when we went to Australia, because we were really hitting on the contrast between true revival, which is confession of sin and repentance and turning, and versus what they had been doing, which was this just emotional show, basically. It was really hitting hard, and they had a heart for revival. They just had never been invited into the real thing. And so we were very humbled that God would use us in that way. But it did happen at multiple venues to the point where the confession and the prayer and everything was still going when we had to leave to go somewhere else, and it was just still going on. So it was really powerful to see that. But every single time, it was kind of like a big gulp, to get up there and challenge them at that level, especially because the age that we were and
being
inexperienced.
In a foreign culture, I think you're naturally a little more sheepish. And so what God was pushing us to do was so far out of our comfort zone. And I think that's a good summary of our entire speaking career is God pushing us out of our comfort zone and to say things that, because I'm very sensitive. Some people have a sense of style, sense of humor. There's various senses that people are gifted with. I have a sense of an audience. I know if an audience doesn't like me. And it's not necessarily a great sense to have. It'd be a lot easier to be a public speaker if I didn't have that sense. But I think there's a positive side to that sense. I know what the audience needs too. And
so what I remember is the school in Australia. That was one of maybe the second time that you spoke a message on revival. We were supposed to speak to I don't know, there were like 500 high school students.
And junior. They combined for
And it was a special assembly at a Christian school, basically like a teaser message for a youth event we were doing later in the week, and to try to, let them know about it. And so they gave us like a 30-minute slot, maybe a 20-minute slot, I can't remember. But it was going to be just I will share a little bit, you'll share a little bit, make it light and humorous and fun so that hopefully these kids would want to come to the event. But right before you got up there to speak to this group, you were going to go first, I think, and I was going to go second. You told me, and I'm going to give the revival message. And then you just walked up on stage. And I'm thinking, okay, there's one thing with a church, where they're more expecting a challenging message. This is just a school of all these rambunctious kids, and they have no idea. And I was thinking, there's no way that's going to translate in this environment. This was like, they were just ready to go to lunch, and they were just joking around with their friends.
I would have agreed with you. That's what's interesting is the only reason I was doing it is because I felt such a pressing on my soul to do it. And I was arguing with God going, no way, that doesn't fit in this situation at all. We didn't know anyone. We had just shaken the principal's hand, but we didn't say hi to anyone else.
And he was like, wasn't he like asleep in the back row?
He fell asleep in the first minute.
Yeah.
He was in the front row and he fell asleep.
And most of the kids were really not, they could care less. They didn't know who we were.
Second row was shooting spitwads at each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how is a message on true revival in 30 minutes before lunch?
It was the weirdest, most awkward. Yeah. I mean, it has to rank up there as one of the hardest moments in my life to be standing there in front of everyone and feeling like I'm giving, because again, with my ability to discern an audience, I'm wanting to tell God, I know something that you don't, and that is that this doesn't work in this type of environment. And yet God just sort of overruled all that. It's like, Eric, I'm asking for obedience. You trust me, I'll show you what I can do. And
I was very nervous about that one, though. I just could not fathom how it would translate.
So let me set the scene for this one. The principal's asleep.
Yeah.
I want to say that it was about a 40-minute message. I don't remember.
Well, I think you went over, but it didn't matter because the principal was asleep and who's going to stop you? You went over. But it was, it was a short period of time that they gave us.
And so then I called you up to the piano in the front, just like I had in that previous situation. Principal is still asleep.
Did he sleep through the whole thing? I don't remember that.
He slept through the whole thing, and then I had set the mic. I came over and sat next to you. And before I did that, I kept the microphone on a stand and I said, I'm going to leave this microphone up here. And I know that there's some of you in here that need to make things right within this school. And I had given very practical illustrations of what that could look like. And so then I went over. I couldn't ask the principal if it was okay to do it because he was asleep. And I didn't want to draw attention to that. So the whole thing was very awkward. So I came over and I sat next to you. You were playing the piano. And then the lunch bell rings. And if there's one thing that is predictable for junior high school students, lunch bell rings, you're not sitting around in a, deeply convicting service and just sort of hanging out. The principal wakes up. I still feel bad for him because I never had a conversation with him. And no one moved. No one spoke. No one did anything. They just sat still. Principal has no idea what's going on. He's looking around trying to figure it out. Again, I feel terrible for him. You're playing the piano, and nothing happens for about 10 minutes.
Yeah, I played the piano for a long time. Yeah. It was really awkward.
And finally, what we found out was it was the student body president gets up, and he calls out his brother's name and says that, I've dishonored you. I haven't been a good older brother to you, and I want to make that right in front of everyone. And oh, wow. And the younger brother comes up, they hug. I mean, it was one of the most powerful scenes that you could imagine in that age group, too. I mean, it's just like startling. And then this line starts forming. Now, we didn't give them any preparation. We didn't say what happened at the church before this. This is all like recreating itself. And this line forms around, and it goes on for hours. And we had to get to an event. We actually had to speak somewhere.
We had to leave when it was still going. I mean, they skipped lunch. They skipped all their
So we didn't meet anyone.
Classes.
I shook the hand of the principal, never talked with anyone. We sit at the piano, and then we found someone, I think it was even the student body president, who comes up, starts playing the piano instead of you. We slip out. And we're driving away in our car, and someone comes up and knocks on the window. We stop and roll down the window, and they say, I don't know who you are, but there's a group of us that have been praying for, 8 years, for this to happen in this school. And so thank you.
Yeah.
And so
it reminded me a lot of the movie Facing the Giants. Do you remember that movie, the Kendricks movie, where there's someone, I think in that movie, where someone who prays over all the lockers? Or am I getting two movies mixed up?
No, I think that was.
And then revival comes to that school, and you see like this football field, and all these students are praying and making things right. It was very similar to that. Yeah. And it was so unexpected because only the Spirit of God could have done that in that kind of environment. They had no idea who we were. We weren't doing anything that...
And they didn't come to our event because we didn't even talk about our event.
But it was those kind of experiences were to be a part of something God is doing, to be a catalyst for that, to be able to see God work in lives and hearts that way, in spite of our weakness, was incredible.
Well, one plug for Ellerslie is I actually every semester, I give that message that I gave in Australia, I give in our training here. And it's still to this day it's one of the most precious messages. It's sort of hard to even explain what that message is, but it is
Yeah.
very, very special on a personal level to you and I because of what we witness God do. And we've seen, I mean, probably my favorite form of communication isn't just the big stage, with thousands of people out there. It's the small stage, like in the Ellerslie Chapel. I would say that's probably my favorite. If you were to say, name your favorite environments over the years to speak in, and I would say, yeah, that's probably still the best. There have been some really fun events that we've spoken at where the audience is just fully engaged and so excited for the message and ready to respond, and that's obviously that's a lot of fun too.
I remember our very first speaking event was in someone's living room. It wasn't an event. It was like our first time we ever spoke together.
Yeah.
And that was before we were married, when we shared kind of like what God had done between us in our relationship. And we weren't even engaged yet, I don't think. Maybe it was right before we got engaged, but there were probably 40 or 50 people in a living room. But that was really, really special. That was a very low pressure thing because we were just sharing with friends and family. But
well, I remember, I think it was your brother was filming it.
Yeah, we still have a video of it somewhere.
I haven't seen that video.
Yeah,
that's a weird.
It's crazy to think about. But that was like, I look at settings like that, and I feel like those are my favorite environments to share because they feel so real and so genuine and so personal. And
there's no plastic to that kind of a communication. But that is a special memory because that is the first time we ever did the back and forth, which is a unique art form, I think, that we have worked on, because even our first books were back and forth books where I'd write a chapter, you'd write a chapter, and we would sort of reveal a truth or a story in and through a two-perspective lens, which is just highly irregular. And even our communication style has
we definitely complement each other, and we learned that early on. You were definitely you brought the humor and the liveliness to
I was like
the
a
event.
comedian, I think.
You had a very different speaking style back in the day, but we still had challenging messages. I think you've become a lot more of a preacher now than a teacher back then. You used to be more of a teacher, but you were the kind of the funny one. I was the straightforward one. You were the dramatic, long-winded one, and I was just like, just say it. And
you would get to the practicals. I would be visionary, epic, inspirational.
And you can see that in our early books too. You cast this huge vision, and I'm just like, okay, let's break this down into 3 key practical steps. And it was a great compliment to each other. We definitely saw how God equipped us to deliver messages together, and we didn't even know that we were suited to communicate together. That was just something God did.
Yeah. Well, what I'm thinking is maybe we could do almost like a part 2 next week on the impact of being in the public eye. Like, what is that like? Is it healthy? What are the dangers of it? Maybe if there are benefits to it, what was the experience for us? And maybe go into some more dimensionality of just the speaking side of what we've gone through, because there's a lot there. I mean, we've spoken all over the world. I want to, if I said thousands of times, we have spoken thousands of times, whether or not we've spoken around the world thousands of times, but we've spoken many, many times in many, many venues in many, many different types of circumstances, small to very, very large, and spoken on, radio and TV, on all sorts of different types of platforms. And so it'd be interesting just to dive a little deeper into that and unpack that, especially, I mean, I'm sure it'd be interesting for just anyone, but especially those that maybe even have that sense of desire, that calling to be communicators. It would probably be very, very interesting. So does that sound good? Sound like a plan? All right.